and she's also a preparator at the Perot Museum in Dallas, which I have always wanted to go to. I've never made it to Dallas, so I've got to get there. And her talk is, I love the title. Okay, so it's called A Frozen Bone Sandwich Inside of a Frozen Turkey, spilling all the tea on what fossil preparation of the Kikak Tegoseak quarry from Alaska is actually like. So if we were all at the Alaska, the exhibit, we know about cold dinosaurs. So this will be good to kind of follow up on that as well. So anyway, thank you, Hillary. Take it away, please.
Yes, absolutely. And hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you so very much for coming and watching my talk. Before I get started, I just want to say that I absolutely love Utah Paleontology. I think what y'all do with the Utah Friends is absolutely amazing. I actually started my career in the Grand Staircase area, so I am very fond of that area. And I think the Salt Lake Museum is probably one of my top 5 museums ever. So I'm pleased and honored to be a speaker here. So let me go ahead and get my stuff all pulled up here for you. Okay. There we go. Here we are. Okay, so yeah, like was said, I'm going to be talking primarily about the fossil preparation that happens here at the Perot Museum of Nature and Science in Dallas, Texas, where I am the fossil lab manager and one of the paleontologists on staff. And this particular quarry has its very unique and interesting challenges associated with that, which I'm about to get into right here. But before we actually talk specifically about the quarry, I want to give y'all a quick introduction to the site. So we are primarily focused on the Prince Creek Formation. This is a section of late Cretaceous formation that's found in Alaska that is dated to be about 72 to 68 million years old. It is the best outcropping of it is found along the Colville River, which is upper northern Alaska, and the Brook Hit Range Mountains. So this is where a lot of the paleontology happens in the Prince Creek Formation. And in the Prince Creek Formation, there's been a series of dinosaurs and different animals named from this particular site. We, of course, are very proud of our dinosaur that we named, Pacquiaranosaurus Perot, which I'll get into a little more detail here in a minute. But we also, additionally to Pachy, we also have our miniature Tyrannosaurid, our Nanosaurus hoglandi, which our museum also named as well. We have Troodon, and of course, as some of you may know, Troodon is a big waste basket of dinosaurs, so there's no necessarily specific species associated, but we have found teeth and bite marks associated with Troodon. And we have potentially a new species of Sauronitholestes. One of our most recent papers, published now about a year ago, names a tiny jaw fragment from the Prince Creek Formation that we are tentatively saying is a juvenile of one of these animals. And then named by the Alaskan University Museum, Pat Druckenmiller, he named this species of hadrosaur Agronalac Coupencensis, and I struggle with that name a lot, but there has definitely been some controversy about whether or not this is indeed a separate species. And for this talk, I'm actually going to refer to it by what we think it is, which is just a juvenile Edmontosaurus. So a little bit of controversy there. I won't get into it, but I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if anyone's interested. So specifically, the Kikak Tegoseak Quarry is what I'm going to be focusing on. So it's, like I said, it's a section of the Prince Creek Formation. And this particular quarry was discovered in 2005 by our curator, Dr. Tony Filarello, here at the Perot Museum during one of his expeditions up to northern Alaska. He had been working up there since the early 90s, and so was very familiar with this area. And this particular site was very exciting to find. And you can see on the photo on the right-hand side, that's the Colville River. And surrounding the Culver River is these massive cliffs. The picture don't really do justice to the scale. It's certainly a very difficult and challenging hike to get to the top of these cliffs, but that is where you're finding a good portion of your fossils, is usually towards the top of this Brooks Range cliff sides. Here's a photo taken from the field. Interestingly enough, they did not actually camp on the top of these cliffs. These cliffs had a unfortunate habit of calving off at random parts, so they didn't want to potentially set up their camps in an area that may overnight end up falling the 3,000 feet down into the river at a moment's notice. So what they would do every morning is they would actually camp on the opposite side of the river on some sandy bars, and very, very early in the day they get their coffee going and try to start the engines of these boats. Some days they would fail, to then cross the Culver River and hike the very steep hike to these tops of these cliffs range. So there on the left is a smiling Dr. Tony Filarello. He's now an associate professor at Southern Methodist University. And then on the right-hand side, some of you may be familiar with the gentleman on the right. That's Dr. Thomas Adams, who's actually now the curator at the Whitty Museum here in San Antonio. And then another gentleman, Chris Durganic, who is also with SMU as well. And these three gentlemen, along with a group of graduate students and some colleagues from Tokyo University, would go every summer from about June to about August and work up in this area of the Culver River and the Prince Creek Formation. So something to keep in mind, especially with Alaska, we're dealing with up above the Arctic Circle. The weather doesn't ever really get above freezing very often, so it's a super narrow window as far as field work opportunities, and that's why they were only able to work the 3 months that they were there. This is a picture of the Kikak Tegoseak Quarry. So this particular quarry is actually a bone bed situation, much like other Pacquiaranosaurus material that was found in Canada and Alberta. This was a section of a floodplain that the herd of these animals were walking along, traveling. There must have been some sort of flash flooding event that washed away a section of the herd. These animals unfortunately drowned, and then their bodies all piled together. And over a long period of time, we're not entirely sure how long, but we know they must have been on the surface and buried and uncovered multiple times, because we have bite marks from scavengers on some of the bones. We have pre-depositional crushing, so there were other animals walking on top of these bones. And we also have numerous roots and vegetation that carbonized around these fossils before the entire thing was buried. So this entire quarry is quite a jumble of fossil, which is what made it super difficult and challenging ultimately to prep them out. But I'll get into that in just a moment. Like I mentioned, there is a very short window of time in the summer where the weather is even possible to go out there, but we are still talking very cold temperatures. And during the summer of 2006, when the majority of the excavation of this site occurred, we actually were looking at freezing temperatures, 20 to 15 degrees most days. Additionally, they also had some pretty bad snowstorms come through, as in blizzard sort of conditions. And again, we're talking middle of July here. So they often had a lot of trouble with making field jackets with the water freezing over. In this particular picture, there was a NOVA special being filmed about the site. So if you're ever interested, it's a NOVA special that they filmed back in 2006, 2007. They were trying to add salt to the plaster to assist with the setting up of the mixture, but they also had to then boil water at times to even keep it in order to mix it with the plaster. The curator, Dr. Tony, he actually contracted pneumonia and nearly died during this season. So right from the beginning, this quarry was super duper challenging to work on and to experience for everybody involved. Once all these jackets, though, were uncovered and removed from the quarry, everything was in helicopter lifted out. Some of y'all may be, of course, familiar with the work that happens in Grand Staircase with the Denver Museum and the Utah Museum, where they use a helicopter to remove large jackets. But other times you can just literally carry them out of the field. This was not an option here in Alaska. Everything had to be airlifted out from this quarry and then flown from a very small area, pretty much a landing strip on an island, was then flown to Anchorage and then put on the back of a truck and brought back to Dallas. So we're talking lots and lots of people involved to get these things back safely. So here is that landing strip I just mentioned with the spoils of war from, I believe, 2007. So this was the next year. This little landing strip is called Umiat, and like I said, it's basically just a landing strip with one or two small buildings for fishers and the occasional adventurer that is out in this area of Alaska. It is very, very remote. And they would then take those jackets and load them onto a small passenger plane, which is the majority ways most folks travel here in this part of Alaska. And I will point out this brown tarp that they are loading in, that actually is a field jacket. And I'm going to be focusing on that jacket here in a little bit, but I want you to remember what that looks like for later. So once all these jackets are then on the cargo plane, like I said, it flies to Anchorage, then gets put on a freight truck and driven to Dallas. And from about 2006 to actually last year, all of these field jackets, even while they're being prepped, were in our old museum building that is in this area of Dallas called Fair Park, which is this lovely historical place where the Texas State Fair occurs. However, it does suffer from old building syndrome, where despite our collections and our preparators' best efforts, we're still talking no real humidity control, definitely temperature changes, the area flooded numerous times. So these field jackets, although we did the best that we could, they certainly were not in the best of situations. We are very fortunate now, however, to have a brand new collections facility. And of course, if anyone comes to visit, I invite you to send me an email, and I'm happy to show you our new facility because we're very excited about it. So like I mentioned about this quarry and some of these dinosaurs, we have specifically from Kikak to Tegoseak, we have two dinosaurs that were found in this quarry, and from these fossils, we were then able to name them. So Pacquiaranosaurus Perot, of course, is the primary animal that's in this quarry. It is a Centrosaurine dinosaur. It is one of 3 Pacquiaronosauruses, and interestingly enough, it is one of the final Centrosaurine dinosaurs to make it pretty late into the Maastrichtian period. We are not entirely sure why that is. It could be potentially because they were so far north. There potentially was some sort of geological barrier that helped to provide a bit of a sanctuary setting here in northern Alaska that allowed these animals to remain isolated and protected from whatever other biological or ecological stuff that was happening further south in Canada and North America, where animals like Triceratops were beginning to dominate the area. But like I mentioned, it's one of 3. So the very top, of course, is Pacquiaranosaurus Perot. And I do want to point out some of the differences with Perot that especially folks that like to reconstruct these animals may not notice. But primarily one of the biggest differences with Perot is that its upper rostral beak is extremely blunted. And we have found this across multiple individuals. This is not something of like, oh, the one animal just happened to broken off its beak. It is unusually blunted for Centrosaurines and at a greater whole for Ceratopsians in general. The middle one is Canadensis. This is the animal that actually was named first back in I believe the 1950s, and it is similar to Perot, but this animal is actually much larger. We're talking potentially 20 to 25% larger than the other Pacquiaranosaurus species. And the bottom one, I believe, is what most people are familiar with, and this is Pacquiaranosaurus lacusti, with the animals found in a large bone bed situation in Alberta. And this animal is very famous for its massive horn on the center of its frill that we suspect there was some sort of bony growth on Perot, but we have not found any evidence that they had a large protrusion on their midline bar. The other defining feature of Perot is the robustness of its nasal boss. That is the bone that is sitting up on top of the nasal bone. Perot as a group is unique in the fact that they have their horn material doesn't form into nasal and orbital horns like we're used to seeing on other ceratopsian animals, but in fact just kind of remain this loosey pad of bone that then probably would have had a fatty pad on top of it. One of the suspected behaviors for this bone, this nasal boss, was potentially they were using it in a shoving or impact motion while potentially displaying or rival males for mating purposes. But with anything behavior, it's always a little hand wavy, so we're of course never 100% sure what the use of it was. Here is our Pacquiaranosaurus peroorum on display here at the Perot Museum. I'm actually literally sitting in front of it right now in the lab, so I can just look out and see at our beautiful species. The skull on the right is actually the holotype skull, and that is the actual fossil specimen. This particular skull is very interesting in the fact that that is heavily rebuilt as far as piecing everything together. All of it is pretty much bone with a few areas that are reconstructed with a two-part putty, but it was severely smashed, especially along the side of the face and the maxilla area. And you may also notice that little blob of bone within the orbital section. And despite it looking like an eye, these dinosaurs did not have bones for eyes. That actually is potentially some internal bone that was shoved into the eye cavity that the preparator at the time, my boss now, Dr. Ron Tchaikovsky, elected to remain since it was bone material. But unfortunately, the folks that cast the skull to then put on display kept that bone in place. So it does unfortunately give the impression that it's an eyeball, which I kind of have an issue with. And maybe one night when I'm feeling particularly sassy, I'll get a Dremel and go scrape it off and pretend nobody did it. But we'll have to see at some point. And then of course I want it, the blunted beak, the rather large, robust nasal boss. The other animal that was found, sections of skeleton was found in the Kikak Tegoseak Quarry, of course, is our miniature tyrannosaurine, Nanosaurus hoglandi. And this one is pretty famous. I've seen a lot of reconstructions around of it being kind of this snowy area of feathered. We don't have any evidence for feathers, but it certainly is absolutely within the possibility of it, of course, being an early tyrannosaurine. And so you can see it, how it plays out here, where it's under Tyrannosauridae, but it still is not necessarily closely related to T-Rex. We're still talking much earlier, and the size of this animal is much smaller than what you'd expect to see from other Tyrannosaurs. This is the extent of the material that we recovered from this site that we can positively identify as theropod and as Nanosaurus. So it's a lower jaw section of the dennary, a little bit of the upper skull, and a tiny bit of the roof of the skull that we also have as well. And here is those pieces. We actually placed them on display in a 3D printed model that was sculpted and done by the Trebold Paleontology. They did a wonderful job. And they're also the ones that then did a reconstruction skeleton, which my boss, Dr. Ron Tchaikovsky, is currently standing next to for scale. And he looms over the prep lab looking down on visitors. Now we do enjoy the skeleton, and my coworkers always appreciate taking the time to have some fun with it, like photoshopping myself into it, proudly perched on the back of it. But we, of course, in real life would never sit on the skeleton. So now that everyone has a basic understanding of this quarry, of the animals that we find in there, let's start diving specifically into the prep, which is primarily my background. I am a fossil preparator, so this is certainly my bread and butter right here. And I want to begin with the site itself. Like I mentioned earlier, is a bone bed situation. And unfortunately, the folks that worked out there did their best to map it for us. But the reality was it was a very challenging area to map because everything is so tightly packed and jumbled together. Additionally, it was visually challenging to make any sort of field identifications. So when we're working in the quarry, we really only have these blobs that are associated with the field jacket with some tentative field identification of the material that's potentially in these jackets. But we certainly have come to find multiple times that these field identification is not very reliable. And so we don't really pay too much attention to the field ID, but we certainly are slowly working our way through all of these jackets that were collected from 2006 and 2007, with a few pieces collected first in 2005 when it was first discovered. The field jacket themselves also come in a wide range of situations. I'm going to try to say this as kindly as I can, but the folks that were making field jackets were not trained preparators. I will definitely say they were curators that knew enough to be dangerous, but unfortunately didn't know enough to actually deal with the situations. So occasionally we'll get field jackets like the one on the upper left-hand corner there that for the most part is pretty good, pretty even, burlap, wrapping, everything is covered in paper towel. Or we'll get ones on the right-hand side where if you can see in one section of it, the right-hand side of that jacket is super duper molded onto whatever that is in, causing this really tight pinching area. And then I will say after cutting open this jacket, one side has 20 layers of burlap and plaster that literally took hours to cut through. And the other side is literally one layer of burlap and plaster. So I have no idea what was happening. Potentially, Tony, this is when he was super sick. So maybe he was delirious. But the range of field jackets we get run the scope, and it certainly makes it for a challenging situation trying to open these jackets, not let alone the preservation within. We also, unfortunately, have now received a jacket that looks like this. Again, you may have remembered that brown tarp that occurred in slides previous, and this is unfortunately what the jacket ultimately looked like 16 years later. But again, I'm going to get a little bit more into detail about what we did with that, but you can just see, unfortunately, this is not a typical situation and fossil preparation that you would have to be dealing with, and so it certainly presented its own unique challenges, and challenges that as I slowly realized how tough this was going to be, you can see I was not impressed whatsoever with the situation, but we got it done, and I'm very excited to show you what we ultimately got out of that. In addition to the kind of inexperience of some of the field jacketing techniques that were happening out there, the quarry itself was also a challenge alone. And part of that challenge was not only the matrix that surrounds these fossils is extremely hard and dense. It's almost a slate shale sort of situation. So it cracks very easily, but not in ways that are very useful to utilize. But it also is, the entire quarry was still within the permafrost layer of the hillside, which meant that throughout the entire quarry were large seams of ice that they unfortunately out in the field could not identify since it was the same color as the rock around it. I mean, the entire quarry was ultimately frozen, so it was impossible to tell what was ice and what was rock. And so when they jacketed everything together and it made its move down to Dallas, of course being a much warmer situation, the entire ice within the jacket melted away, which left massive ravines of cracks running throughout these entire field jackets, but also large void spaces that over the many years these fossils dried out in and then unfortunately disintegrated and collapsed into. So it is not at all unusual to open up one of these field jackets and have an entire section of broken bone and fossil with pieces being no larger than my fingernail. And it can be extremely frustrating, and it's just part of the challenge of dealing with this site. We also had to get comfortable with unusual things showing up in the jacket. So this particular clump of moss, the folks out in the field actually used as padding because they had run out of paper towel and toilet paper. So this moss was useful at the time, but unfortunately, because it remained in the jacket for such a long period of time, of course, we're talking 10 years since before we got the chance to crack open some of these field jackets, sections of it had actually molded and were rotting to the point of where they were impacting the fossils around them. This particular clump of moss came out of a jacket that they nicknamed Kate Moss because it was tall and skinny and had moss inside of it. So that was the nickname of this field jacket. And we also do like, as a funny aside, we do like to nickname all of our jackets because the field numbers are long and tedious for me to say all the time. We tend to name them after different internet memes. So we have Box of Chocolates, Moto Moto, smoked meats. I just have one named 2020, which you'll see in a minute, which is a complete disaster. So we do try and have a little bit of fun with our field jackets when opening these up. When we finally get these jackets open, the things inside of them stabilized, we then are faced with yet another hurdle. And that is that these jackets are completely full of very dense piles of bone with little to no separation between the different bones. This entire field site was, of course, before it was buried, like I mentioned, it was stepped on, it was vegetation grew around it, it was scavenged. And so the entire pile is super duper mixed up, which is another reason why it's impossible to have really good quarry maps. There's just not one fossil bearing layer. Typically, when you're working in fossil preparation, when you open up a field jacket, you want to open it in a way that you're working down to the fossil bearing layer. You then clean up that layer. You understand where everything is. You can do a little bit of stabilizations on the fossil. You then will build a temporary top cradle where you flip the entire specimen and you do the same thing on the bottom, working that matrix away down to the fossil bearing layer, to ultimately all you have left are those fossils. And then from there, you can continue stabilizing, gluing them together, and they go into collections. Well, Kikak, Tegoseak, there is no one fossil bearing layer. The entire thing is a layer of bone. So for example, here is that 2020 jacket I mentioned. And looking at this as a trained preparator, I literally cannot tell you what is matrix and what is fossil. And we have come to find out that the entire jacket is actually completely fossil. So the upper part of the jacket, that is actually a heavily broken up skull. There is a brain case with a section of the maxilla and the sides of the face, with on top, kind of separated up a little bit, is chunks of nasal boss. And then further down the jacket, you actually can see the circle area of a centrum with a rib directly underneath it. And then that last little glob off to the right-hand side of the jacket is an orbital boss, which is part of the nasal boss that then would go over the orbital section of the skull. And I literally just found that out the other day after looking at this thing for months, because you have to almost put on a second pair of glasses and start noticing certain things that sometimes are not apparent until someone else, literally my boss, comes in and says, hey, isn't that a brain case? So it is not your standard straightforward preparation of, cool, I have a limb bone, I know what to do with this. Everything is on top of each other. Everything is inside each other. The holotype skull that I showed earlier that's out on display literally had an entire femur shoved up and through its nasal cavity. So Ron had to actually remove that femur and reconstruct the nasal cavity before it could go on display. This particular photo right here, I think, displays this very well. We have a fibula, we have a vertebra, there is a parietal section of the horn, a section of the frill and horn in there. There is ribs, there's another vertebra, and they're all just smacked on top of each other, inside each other. It is a complete mess. So the preparation of this site was something that when I first started, I was not fully prepared for. When I was first hired, I was told by Ron Tykowski, my boss, this would be the hardest thing I'd ever work on. And I, of course, thought to myself, I've worked on some pretty hard site. I've dealt with Hell Creek material. This can't be that bad. And boy, howdy, was I wrong. I have now worked on this site for almost 3 years, and it is easily the most challenging prep I personally have ever done, and also my staff and my volunteers have ever done. So I want to very quickly go into the different tools that we use, and this is stuff that we have found works really, really well for us. Of course, I would say 99% of the tools that we use for this type of material is mechanical preparation, specifically with two different air scribes. We have tried everything under the sun. The matrix is just too hard for anything else to work besides air scribes. And I would say the majority of the air scribing is done with the Chicago Pneumatics 9100 series. I love these air scribes. They are a power horse. They literally keep functioning even when you are smacking them around and insulting their mom. They're absolutely amazing. And then for smaller detail preparation, we do use the Aero series of air scribes from Paleo Tools. dipped my toes into the German HW scribes, and I'll be honest, I'm not that impressed just yet with them. They are really not capable of handling our matrix. And I'm sure some folks out there that might be like, oh, come on, how hard could it be? This stuff is harder than concrete. So when we say we have to use the heavy duty scribes, it is very true. We then, for all of our materials, we use primarily Butvar. I know a lot of preparators tend to use B72. We just have found that B76, which is Butvar, works better for our situation. My boss, Ron, has used it for 30-something years and never had any problem with it discoloring or weakening over time. If we do have a larger fit between fossils, for example, if we have a large limb bone, we have a nice tight locking fit that needs to go together, we do use a metal set epoxy. Unlike other epoxies, like a 2-part 5-minute epoxy, those do yellow and become brittle over time. So we don't use anything like this, but this metal set epoxy is actually what they use to put rockets together. So we feel fairly confident that it is long lasting. And like I said, my boss has been using it his entire career and never had any problem with it. And then finally, we to fill any sort of gaps that may remain or to help stabilize the specimen even further before it goes into our collection space, we do use an epoxy sculpt for gap filling. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the incredible volunteers that I have that would do all of this work. I feel like the only reason I hang on to them is because they don't know any better. They've never worked in another fossil prep lab, and so they don't realize how god awful the prep on this can actually be. But I certainly could not get this done without them. So I, of course, am very, very grateful to my crew for doing that. And occasionally we have some help from the little helpers. That is actually a Lego version of my boss Ron that I made, and so he needs, of course, to get in on the action every once in a while. And once these fossils are all then prepped out to the best of our abilities, they're separated if we can, they're fully cleaned up. They then have an archival cradle made for it. So this is actually a Pacquiaranosaurus skull that is upside down. So the nasal boss is actually down into the sand. And you can see on the left-hand side, that is the upper rostral beak. And this is this skull on the other side. It's a really beautiful specimen. And it's got this really odd, unique bump at the base of the nasal boss that we've actually found in a couple other skulls that we then added to an updated publication about Pacquiaranosaurus. This is also a defining characteristic of the species, this odd little pimple-like thing at the end of its nose. And our fossils are then put in archival cradles like you would see at other museums. This is something that I'm, of course, a big fan of doing, is making sure this material gets protected over a very long period of time. We use a felt separator and a hydrocal plaster, which is of a higher quality and different grade than your standard molding plaster. And additionally, we can also then make clamshell jackets, which if a researcher needs to come in and take a look at our skulls, that on the left-hand side, that's actually a Pacquiaranosaurus skull in there, we can then remove sections of the jacket and have the object still supported within the jacket despite turning it and flipping it around. And finally, it will be put in our new collections facility. And this is actually something we've been doing over the past couple months here is we've laid out the entirety of Kikak Tegoseak, what is prepped so far. We still have about 4 field jackets to finish. So we're still looking at potentially another year to 2 years of prep, but they've been working on this stuff since 2011, 2012. And so over that time, you definitely accumulate a lot of material. So they're laying out on the tables. That's easily 8 or 9 long white tables full of material. So it's really, really astonishing to walk through and just see all of these different elements lined up. So I do want to just end this whole thing of specifically highlighting that brown tarp jacket I mentioned earlier, because I think this is really easily the most challenging project we've had, but it has ended up being one of the more successful projects that we've had. So like I mentioned earlier, you guys saw how badly shattered it was, and that was for 2 different reasons. The first reason is that, again, this is collected in 2006 during that horrible weather, and so this was a jacket where they boiled the water to try and keep it from freezing, and that boiling of the water did seem to inhibit the chemical reaction of the plaster and the water, where the plaster did not set properly, and so the entire field jacket ultimately failed when they flipped it. So to try and keep it all together as much as they could, they then wrapped that brown tarp around it, tied it with ropes, and that probably would have done the job for the most part if it hadn't been smacked not once but twice by the helicopter lifting it into the side of the cliff. It wasn't the helicopter operator's fault. When it was being lifted, a large cross breeze came through and just unfortunately caused the entire jacket to swing and to bang very sharply into the cliff. However, they had no concept of the total damage that was done, and we didn't actually find out what was done until back in 2019. We finally opened this jacket, and as my boss was loading it off of his truck onto our cart, he mentioned to me that he heard it crunch, which is never a thing that you ever want your boss to say about a field jacket. And lo and behold, when we unwrapped it, that was what awaited us. But we were thankfully able to still retain some information. We were able to gain the field number back, which beforehand was a mystery. We had no idea what field number was associated. So again, there's some photos of the jacket out in the field. I love the fact that they placed it on a pallet far away from the rest of the fossils, as if it was a misbehaving child. I think that's so silly. But what we did is we very carefully processed through this jacket. And how we did that was by actually creating a 5-inch by 5-inch square template that we would then lay over a section of the rubble and very carefully pull out pieces of what was fossil versus what was rock. And you can see down on the base of that picture, some of those pieces, then we would attempt to puzzle them together as best as we could. And to some extent, we were successful with that. But you can see within the white boxes, there were just some pieces that were so badly demolished, there was no possibility of finding any sort of reconstructive fits. We also had this section of flat material, which was very intriguing. And one of my staff, Brianna, did an incredible job keeping all of this material associated. And then the only chunk of rock that survived through that entire process was this one on the right-hand side. And those of you who are very eagle-eyed already can tell what is coming out of there. But we were super excited to see that a large, beautiful brain case with occipital condyle did actually emerge from that chunk of rock. And it is actually the most complete brain case that we have. So here are some examples of some of the other brain cases in our collection that have been collected prior and previously, and you can see this one is far more complete, far more robust. So despite the fact that it came out of a destroyed jacket, it actually is an astonishingly beautiful specimen and very important to our research. We also were able to reconstruct and emerge out of the jacket this orbital boss. Again, this is a section of face that is the boss that's above the eye, and up until this point, it was one of the most was one of the largest and most complete orbital bosses that we had, although I mentioned earlier we do have another orbital boss emerging out of our 2020 jacket. And then we were able to retain some other elements, rebuild them from the pieces. The right-hand one is a section of pubic bone that, again, Brianna literally piece by piece glued together. And despite the fact that it looks hideous, I think it's absolutely incredible that she was able to get it that complete from the rubble that it ultimately came from. And here are some other elements that we ultimately recovered. This is a chunk of limb bone that we managed to most part piece together, but unfortunately there was too much missing in between fits, so that is the extent that we can get it to fit together. Some stuff was just too badly demolished that we ultimately just cut our losses and said, look, this is what the jacket looked like, this is the material. So that in itself has its own information associated with it. It tells the history of this site and this jacket. And then to some extent, like I mentioned earlier, we just had pieces that we couldn't get back together. You know, unfortunately, it happens. You do the best that you can. And these pieces were ultimately too small, but they could be potentially useful in the future for destructive analysis on this site. So everything is kept, everything is going into our collections with this site. So in conclusion, this project is almost done. I mentioned we have 4 more jackets to finish, 2 of which are being prepared at the moment. So I'm expecting probably another year or 2 of fossil preparation. And at this moment, we know for sure we have at least 15 individuals. We suspect we could have anything up to 22 individuals from this site. And they're all ranging from young juvenile animals all the way to full adults. So we do actually have an entire ontogenetic series of Pacquiaranosaurus Perot. And we are certainly crossing our fingers that we can potentially find some more Nanosaurus material. As of right now, the skull materials I showed earlier is the only material we've gained from this jacket. But we of course have it all in our collections, and we're hoping at some point that perhaps a Tyrannosaur expert can maybe come and look at some of these mystery bones, and who knows, maybe we do in fact have more Nanosaurus material in our collections. So I just want to say thank you so much for your attention, and I am very happy to open the floor up to questions. Thank you so much.
Yay, thanks, Hillary.